How's it going, everyone? Welcome to another video on the Vue 3 Essentials and Fundamentals. And here on today's video we're going to look at CSS models. This specific section where we're going to explore and discuss about what are the things that we can now use in our SVC, or the single file components, which is the way of how now we can define our components. And I think that a lot of people actually fell in love with the single file component, but the reality is that what is the problem that this Vue thing actually solves? And that's what is things started to be much more compelling when it comes to building this user interface in a scalable way. And that is that instead of us, unlike React, where we need to actually handle all of these different states per component, right? And at the end of the day, those user components or those elements that we are creating or using a wrapper around the DOM, the create element, okay, where the first argument you take, hey, this will be the tag, this will be the props, and this will be the children component that you want to render that. So instead of us having to actually per each one of these components, and also following is the atomic design principle that you start with the atoms and then with the molecules and then with particles and then with page and then with the website, right? So instead of actually starting from there, React say, hey, I'm going to now provide you a way of how you can manage all of your state updates, so you only focuses on building what are the state that this application needs, and behind the scenes I'm going to handle is this reactivity data, and now update that to the DOM when those JavaScript reactive values change. So this is something that is compelling, because unlike when we write React application, where the whole point of this is to define on each one of these small components or HTML components or a small set of components, where you need to define is a specific use of you need to define the state, and that state is just describing is that how this UI gonna look like based on a particular logic and update logic, okay? And how that initially they were using something called like class components, and where you have now, for example, is this life cycle hook that can happen to this component did mount and component will mount, okay, as a way to know what to do or what are the code that we're going to run when we are at those particular stage. So in this way of describing UI elements, right, and because you not only have to take care of the local state in your component, but also is state that are shared across different components. This is known as state lifting. So you are now have the ability to pass this state to all of the child component that it needs to, and if you have a long tail of child components, you need to pass that props until the particularly grandchild component that's going to make use of it. So to prevent that, we have now these things called context, which is a store in memory that we're going to now put all of this particular state that we want to share across that using the provide tag, where in there we're going to now share is the value, or on the value property we're going to share is the state of these components that are now down in this subtree. So putting the provider at a particular position of the DOM tree will allow us to now is provide that state under that subset of node trees. So because of that, again, I have mentioned all of these kind of things, and all of these things require some careful programming to keep track all of these state changes, and that's one of the reasons why we have, for example, things like Redux that wants to actually, where the whole idea is to make the state management and state mutations predictable and maintainable. So, however, in our local components, we still have to manage all of our state by ourselves, as well as when this will get triggered, and understand now how React do that thing. So Vue say, hey, instead of you having to worry about when this state change and try to fine-tune optimization, which is something that you do with React components, is like, hey, I just want us to update this on a specific event handler, or I want to now update the state over a particular use effect or this network operation that we can perform on that. And not only that, I want you to now is pass down this component or only re-render a component when any of it is prop change. So I have to use this memo or use callback to store the function reference or the computations and only rerun that when that change. So again, I have talked a lot, but the value proposition here of Vue is say, hey, let me now be the one that is going to handle all of these optimizations behind the scene. You just only take care of your reactive data that will change over time, and I'm going to handle now all of these performance optimizations in terms of how we're going to update it down. So this is quite interesting because now we abstract away is how now the Vue is doing the thing that it does, specifically the reactivity data. So by the time that this data changes, now is applying the necessary DOM updates to the DOM, okay? And we don't have to worry about that. And not only that, is this problem when it comes to handle is state in multiple components. And for handling is common use case like handling a form, now in Vue things becomes a little bit more straightforward. So you can define is a V model, which is a concept from Angular that say, hey, I'm gonna listen is for the input event, and I'm gonna bind that data to the value property. So you have now this two-way data binding, which is something that we recurrently use that a lot, especially on forms. So now the point of this is that it's bringing all of these particular ideas from frameworks like React, Angular, and Svelte as well here. So we went through all of this, and now we are going to talk about is the CSS models. So because with React application we can use this Tailwind by de facto, all right? Now here, since our styles can be encapsulated in one single file, the SVC, we're gonna see how can we actually, what are the tools that Vue provide for us. Pretty much is that, right? CSS model recommendations, prefix the component name to it. So it's a super long, might be some performance issue. So this is now talking about is global and the scope here. And how now in CSS models.
So we talked about, we're going to take, you might want it, you render everywhere. The one that's the most popular is something called scope styles. And if you've never heard of scope styles before, they're basically a way to do exactly as the naming convention sounds, to scope your styles to a specific area. And so what is actually happening underneath the hood, right? Because I talked a lot about Vue building on what already exists in the ecosystem. Well, Scope CSS, what it's actually doing, if we take a look here, is it's actually taking a look at the elements that are relevant to this particular component, and it's appending a unique data attribute. So you see here this data-v-b600. That is what's basically being appended to the HTML. And then what's cool about this is if you look at the, not the console, where's my CSS? Oh, it's down here, I hit it. Look at this style. It's button using the attribute selector to then go ahead and apply those styles specifically within that context. And that actually works pretty well, assuming that the rest of your global CSS isn't written in a highly specific way. This actually works really great, and a lot of people have a lot of success using scope styles. But scope styles isn't perfect, because if we went ahead and, I don't know, did something a little bit more specific like this, I think that didn't quite do it. It's fine, I'll just do this. I'll just go the lazy route. If someone somewhere in your enterprise app decided to bang import in the button, scope styles are not going to save you by any means. You are still going to have to be stuck with the cascade effect.
So scope style here, what it's doing is to attach. They don't mention anything related to scope models here, styling here, styling global and component, exactly. So style, the difference between CSS model and a style, okay, style, scope, CSS scope, exactly, CSS scope attribute is using the data attribute exactly, is using the data attribute exactly, is CSS scope attribute is putting a data attribute, okay. So CSS scope attribute is putting a data attribute, is putting a hash. So it's putting a hash. CSS scope attribute is putting a hash data attribute here, like this. So CSS scope attribute is putting a hash data attributes. Exactly, it's putting a hash content in the data attributes, okay, and apply CSS and set exactly to set CSS property in a component. So it's using now the attributes, it's putting, exactly, so the CSS scope attribute, the difference between scope and the models is both of them generate hash, but scope is under the data attributes here, and the component is under the class name, right? So now you have much more, the subtle difference is that it's specificity. It solves a specificity here. Exactly. CSS are truly CSS scope, and in JavaScript scenario where you want to protect a class, it solves a specificity. It solves a specificity problems. It solves CSS specificity problems. That's what happened. So CSS scope and CSS models, okay, makes a lot of sense. It solve, they want to solve a specificity, they want to solve CSS specificity problem or issues. Scope Scope use an approach of putting a hash content in a data attribute. Scope use an approach of putting a hash content in the data is generating a hash content in a data attribute to set up. So they want to solve the CSS specificity issue. Scope and models use an approach of generating a hash content. The first put it in a data attribute. Exactly, in a data attribute. The latter generate a CSS class. Exactly, generate a CSS class. Exactly. Use both of the row of hash content. The first, putting in a data attribute, and the latter, generate a CSS class with the hash. Okay. So that's the whole point of this. And if you need to specificity, okay. So in other words, exactly. So they solve these specificity issues.
And there's something to be said about being disciplined about writing your CSS. So that could be something your team does. But what if there was a better way? Okay, so we talked about scoped. What about CSS modules? You might not have heard a lot about it, but, and this is a feature that's not talked about a lot about, but what you can do is you can actually go ahead.
You may wonder, what is CSS specificity? Okay, it's an algorithm used by the browser to determine the CSS declaration that is the most relevant to an element. Which this is an algorithm. Interesting. That is the most relevant to an element, which in turn determines the property value to apply to an element or to the element. The specificity algorithm calculates the weight of a CSS selector to determine which rule from competing CSS declaration get applied to an element. Browsers consider specificity after determining cascade origin and importance. In other words, for competing property declaration, specificity is relevant and compare only between selector from one cascade origin and a layer that has precedence for the property. Scoping proximity and in order of appearance becomes relevant when the selector scoping proximity. This is now the CSS. And we most of the time invest our time is on how can we actually is writing JavaScript applications, scoping proximity. An order of appearance becomes relevant when the selector specificity of the competing declaration in the cascade layer with preceding are equal. Okay. There is a lot of jargon works here that I want to flesh it out. Okay? I want to flesh it out. Flesh. That I want to flesh it out. Okay? Okay. So, you may wonder, okay, so what is specificity? specificity, right? Glad you asked. So it's an algorithm used by the browser to determine the CSS declaration. So what's a CSS declaration? CSS is a rule-based language. It's a rules-based language, which is you define the rules by specifying groups of styles that should be applied to a particular element. Group of styles. Or you define rules by specifying group of styles that should be applied to a particular element. But this is interesting, is you define the rules here by specifying group of styles. For example, you can describe to have the main heading on your page to be shown as a later regex text. The following code show a very simple CSS rules or CSS declaration, as they call, that will achieve the styling described before. But this is a rule, right? This is a rule. So you define the rules. You define the rules. So you define the rules. Open with a selector. In the above example, the CSS rules open with a selector. So you define the rules with a selector, and this select the HTML element that we are going to style. In this case, we're still 11.1 headings. We're styling 11.1 headings. We have a set of curly braces. Inside of braces will be one or more declarations, which takes the form property and value, which takes the form key value here, or property value. We specify the property color here, and in this example contains two declarations, one color, and this is interesting because this is now CSS declaration, one for color and the other for font size. Each pairing specify a property of the elements we are selecting. H1 in this case, then a value that we would like to give the property. But again, so a specificity, let me actually write this. So a specificity is an algorithm. So specificity is the algorithm used by the browser to determine. So specificity is the browser is the algorithm used by the browser. Okay. So specificity is the algorithm used by browsers to determine the CSS declaration. The CSS declaration. We're going to discuss more about that. That is to determine the CSS declaration that is the most relevant to an element. That is the most relevant to an element. But again, it's a series of steps used by the browser to determine the CSS declaration. The CSS declaration or the CSS rule, okay? And the CSS declaration is this rules that specify a group of style that should be applied to a particular element or group of elements in your web page. So the CSS declaration here is the algorithm used by the browser to determine the CSS declaration that is the most relevant to an element. Exactly, that is the most relevant to an element, which in turn, determines the property and values to apply to the element. Exactly. Which in turn determines the property and values, the property value, the property value to apply to an element, The specificity algorithm calculates the weight. Okay, the specificity algorithm calculates the weight of a CSS selector. Okay, to determine. Okay, so the specificity. So the specificity algorithm. So the specificity algorithm calculates the weight of the CSS selector. Calculates the weight of a CSS selector. Calculates the weight of a CSS selector. The following selectors, which allows styles to be conditioned based on various features. This is selector. The following are various selectors. This is quite interesting. The CSS selectors models define the pattern to select elements to which a set of CSS rules are applied, along with their specificity. So the CSS selectors model provide us with more than 60 selectors and 5 combinators. Other models provide additional pseudo-class selectors and pseudo-elements. Other models provide pseudo-class elements and pseudo-selectors. If in CSS, selectors are patterns used to match or select the elements you want to style. Period, man. Exactly. So CSS selectors models define the patterns to select elements to which a set of CSS rules are then applied. So our patterns to use to match or select the element that you want. So CSS selectors are patterns. Selectors are also using JavaScript to enable selecting the DOM to return a node list. Selectors, whether using CSS or JavaScript, enable targeting HTML based on their type. But this selectors is a pattern. It's similar with the specificity. So CSS selectors are patterns. Okay, so pretty much like match, which is our patterns. Okay, our patterns used to match or select the element you want to style. So the specificity algorithm calculates the weight of a CSS selectors, which is the pattern of a CSS selectors, a pattern to determine a set of rules where a pattern used to match, a set of rules, or a set of is used to match or select, okay, is used to match or select the element you want to style. The elements you want to style. Selectors are also used in JavaScript. Selectors, whether using CSS or JavaScript, enabling targeting HTML elements based on their type, attributes, current state, and even position in the DOM. So CSS selector. So CSS selectors, okay, CSS selectors enables to targeting HTML elements. CSS selectors allow us to target. If you remember for how you get access to the DOM elements, you can apply some operation to the DOM, whether it is get element by ID or query selector, for example, query selector all and get element by class name or tag name. All right. But here we have now this JavaScript selector, CSS selectors, CSS or JavaScript selectors. All right. Allow us, and you want to know what these. Okay. Okay. Let's get into this, bro. CSS exactly. CSS selectors or JavaScript selectors. Okay. CSS selectors or JavaScript selectors. And when you say JavaScript selectors, we talk about query selectors, right? We're talking about query selectors. Okay, CSS selector or JavaScript selectors allows to target elements, HTML elements, allows to target HTML elements, okay, allows to target HTML elements based on their type, exactly, based on their type of elements, attribute, attributes, current state, and even position in the DOM. Combinators allow us to be more precise when selecting elements by enabling selecting elements based on their relationship to other elements. So when selecting elements by enabling combinators, because we also have now combinators, they don't actually mention too much here. Selectors and combinators here. Selectors and combinators. Selectors are used to define a pattern of the element that you want to select for applying a set of CSS rules on the selected elements. Combinators define the relationship between the selectors, the relationship between these elements, the relationship between these elements selected, between the selectors. If a selector is used to determine is the element, is a pattern to determine the element that you want to apply some styles. Now these elements or these combinators define the relationship between the selectors. So, an example of that, all right? Using CSS combinator can combine selectors to select DOMs. Okay, can combine selectors to select DOM nodes based on their relationship and other elements within the document node tree. This combining of selectors with combinators create complex selectors. Okay. This is a combination of selectors here. You say, hey, get me now, select this element. Okay. Select these elements based on this. Or you can say, hey, select all of these elements, all of these elements that have the class box attached to it. Selectors can be read from right to left. So matches all elements with a class icon that are direct children of an element. Okay, this is the way how you read this. Okay, from right to left. Interesting. Okay, so match all of the elements with the class icon attached to that are direct children of the element that are direct children of an A element with the ID selected. With the ID selected, with all of the direct children of an anchor element with the ID selected. And in this case, you say select all the paragraph elements to come immediately after. Okay, to come. This is now select all the parents. Select all the matches all element with a class. Exactly, matches all element with a class icons that are direct children of an anchor tag of an anchor element with the ID selected. And this is say, hey, select the paragraph or match the first paragraph, because here you are saying it's the first. Select the first paragraph that comes immediately after an H2 element. Immediately after an H2 element that are descendant of any elements with the class of box. This is something important to actually read this, because if you're able to read this, now you're able to understand what this complex selector is all about. So the way to read is that this indicating is that all direct children's, this indicates is the first element here. And doing this practice of reading the CSS, so for example here you say, hey, this is relative selectors. Match all elements with the ID reference that are direct children of this div tag with the ID topic that follow after this element. Relative selector cannot be used in selector list. Rather, it is set with certain context, such as has pseudo class. Question. Because now this is CSS, man. Now this is CSS. All right. Okay. Makes a lot of sense. Okay. Oh my God. Okay. There is a lot of things going on here. So what I want to do here is to say, ask, how do you read this? Okay, so by the time that I have to read this data here, how do you read this? Okay. So I know how to read these complex selectors, which is a sequence of one or more simple and or compound selectors, patterns that allow to no, really, what? Selectors, patterns, to retrieve element. I don't know why they moved that. Exactly. So it's a pattern for selecting elements. Exactly. Pattern for selecting HTML elements based on their type, attributes, current state, and even position. A current state is this, okay, and current state is, for example, focus, or is active and is hover. Current state here. Okay, Jesus. Okay. Now. Okay. All right. Okay, makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. Qué mariquera, weón. All right. Okay. So, this is all about this. It's like you're starting to ask questions that you deeply get into the rabbit hole. So specificity is an algorithm used to determine, it's an algorithm used by browsers. Okay, it's an algorithm used by browsers to determine the CSS declaration. And this is CSS declaration. It's made of the CSS class, the CSS rule. Okay, the CSS declaration is this set of rules that are going to be up. This set of that the rules by specifying a group of styles that should be applied to a particular elements or a group of them in your web page. So define the rules specifying so defines the rule is specifying is a group of styles that should be applied to a particular elements or a group of elements. And this is something interesting with this CSS declaration, because this rules, which is made of the Css selectors, which is now the pattern matching to which is the matching pattern. Okay, is a pattern for matching elements. Okay, is a pattern for matching. Is a pattern for. Is a pattern for matching. Is a pattern for matching and selecting elements. HTML elements based on their type. Based on their type, the attributes, the current states, and even position in the DOM. And even positioning in the DOM, because that's what you can use is the end lath and child and all that kind of thing. Oh my God, let me actually write this down here, because this is very important to describe this, because a lot of things like, we know what CSS selector, we know what selecting is, what is the specificity problem is, but if you can describe that question, do you really know about it? And this is when things started to come here in the philosophical aspect, to see is that, hey, if you truly know something, you are going to express that. Well, in any case, again, it is important to do that. It is important for you to express and to clarify your ideas in the most concise way possible, because at the end of the day, it's all about outcomes. It's about results. Are you getting the outcomes that you want? If it is, great. If it's not, thank you. Okay, so specificity. Okay. So what's specificity, right? Because it says like, well, this is an algorithm used by browsers to determine the CSS declaration. Okay. Jesus fucking Christ. Okay, the CSS declaration. 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 And when I click on this CSS declaration, okay, the CSS declaration, okay, which is a CSS declaration, a rule specifying a range, a rule specifying, exactly, rules, a rules defining by specifying group of styles, rules that define CSS declarations. It says CSS declarations, rules defined by specifying a group of styles that you should be applied to a particular elements, HTML elements, or a group of them, by using a selector, where this is the pattern, a selector, a pattern mechanism for selecting HTML elements based on their, which is here, based on their type, the attributes, the current state, and even the position in the DOM. Thanks. All right, let's go to write this down. It's the CSS declaration that is the most relevant to an element, which in turn determines the property which in turn determine the property value to apply to an element. I'm going to actually write this. So specificity is the specificity. So is the algorithm. So specificity is the algorithm used by the browsers to determine the CSS declaration. The CSS declaration. Declaration. The specificity is the algorithm used by the browser to determine the CSS declaration. As a CSS declaration. Rules defines CSS declarations. Use the rules define rules defined by the user this specifying the group of styles, to apply to an element that should be applied to a particular element. Exactly. Rules defined by the users to specify the group of styles to apply to an element or a group of them. HTML elements. To an element or a group of them. To a group of them based on their to apply to an element, to an HTML element, to a specific HTML element or a group of them based on their type, div, section, main, blah blah blah, yada yada, based on their type, their attributes. And this is where now counts, for example, data, which is you can pass now custom data to that. So data, ID, class, mainly use those. So based on their type, attributes, current state, it is, hey, this element is active or inactive, or is a click in the case of buttons, or is focused or is not in the case of inputs, right? For example, focus, active, visited, right? Focus, active, visited, and the position in the DOM, or the position in the DOM, and even the the position of the DOM. So this is now a specificity, bro. This is specificity, bro. Interesting. And have the ability to now describe that is something important for us. So this CSS selector that is not this CSS selector or JavaScript selectors, both of them allow us to or enable to target HTML elements based on this. So type, attributes, current state, and even the position in the DOM. Yeah, interesting. Very, very, very interesting. And now how CSS models, because we have now this specificity in our class as a way to now solve this particular problem that we can have in our large applications, we say, hey, let's go to now use our CSS scope or CSS model. Both of them are approach that generate hash, where now scope generate a hash under the data attributes, okay? Where now CSS model actually generates a hash class for that. So increasing the specificity of the set of style to apply to the elements or a group of elements, right? So it's solving these specificity problems. However, now that we have Tailwind, is say, hey, you know what? It'll make much more easy to actually generate all the necessary styles that we need to, recurring style that we're gonna use to apply to these particular elements, okay? And compile that so we can generate an optimized CSS class for that. That's a very interesting approach. It's a very interesting thing as well. Okay. All right. Makes a lot of sense. But this is the problem that it's solved, right? This is now the problem that it's solved. Okay. And then you can also have vbind in CSS. So vbind, so you can bind attributes in CSS. Vbind in CSS. Okay.
The one other thing I want to tell you about styling, which most people don't know about when it comes to Vue 3, is that this is great. We have the ability to global styles, we have scope styles, we have CSS modules. For me, one of the things that when it comes to extending on the functionality of the web is how we can bring the technology together in a better way. And so JavaScript is really good at interactivity, managing state, and dynamic pieces of information. CSS is very good at what it does, styling. And so what if you could find a way to actually merge the two together in a way that allows for just crazy possibility? To show you what I mean, let's go ahead and I'm just going to save this right now. And on the app.vue, what if we wanted the ability for the user to choose what the background color is? Typically, the approach for that is you probably would come to your designers and you would say, okay, these are like the 7 classes we'll support, and so we'll try our best to just support it this way, and so you're limited. But there are plenty of cases where you might actually want to give the user infinite configuration, but the reason why we can't do that is because, frankly, managing the CSS for that can be quite difficult. So let's say, for instance, we have that property. So I'm going to import a ref from Vue, and I'm going to call it color preference. It'll be a ref, it'll be an empty, actually we'll say black for now, okay? And so what we'll do here is, what you ideally want to do is you'd like your CSS to
Hi, I'm Emma Boston. I'm an engineering manager at Spotify in Stockholm, and welcome to CSS Foundations. My goal with this course was to help beginners in web development gain confidence reading and writing CSS code. In this course,
reading and writing,
we'll start out by learning the terminology and history of CSS. Then we'll move into more foundational concepts like color and typography. We'll wrap things up with some more advanced topics like media queries by learning the terminology and history of CSS. Then we'll move into more foundational concepts like color and typography. We'll wrap things up with some more advanced topics like media queries and responsive design. And finally, we'll take all of these skills that we've learned and apply them in a project where we'll build a website from start to finish. I hope this course gives you a solid foundation to continue on your journey with CSS. What color is our paragraph text going to be in this example here? So we've got a div class of blue. Inside of that div, there's a paragraph. And our style rule here is class blue equals, not equals, but color blue. So what color is our paragraph text going to be?
Still going to be blue.
You think it's going to be blue? Indeed, it is going to be blue. If you can see that text has changed to blue, I know that's not the most accessible blue color. Do we know why that's going to be blue?
Because it,
Who the fuck is this? Specificity, man. Exactly, and cascade and layers and all that kind of thing. Okay. Oh, crap. Okay. This is an interesting segue. It was a very interesting segue because it's just a way to understand now how the browser, this particular tool engine, works in terms of rendering elements. Okay. All right. Okay. And understand the problems that it solves.
Be able to going to actually no, there's a type called color, and so we get shoot, I need to maybe app is too far of a context. There we go. Okay, that context was too high. All right, it's fine. I'll just do the let me do this. Let me wrap this real quick. Okay, so I'll explain why that's not working real quick. It actually does make sense, but for the sake of showing this, there we go. Okay. What we can see here now is you have this infinite loop of JavaScript updating the CSS. Now, if you're skeptical, you're like, this looks like black magic. What's happening here? All right, let me show you. I promise you, when we think about things, we try to think of things in terms of extending the web. Look at actually what's happening here. What Vue does, what JavaScript does well, is it says, okay, I'm going to create a custom variable. But we're going to use CSS variables, because guess what? That is browser technology that is actively supported, and why would we try to reinvent the wheel? And so all JavaScript's doing is it's actually just tracking this variable and just making sure to update that value. But the rest of it is CSS. So you get the power of CSS and cascades and everything in its native form, but you also get the power of getting reactive data that can impact those things. So you can imagine, like, oh, the number of times I've been on apps where I wanted to customize the font size or the padding, like those are hard to do because to create a class for every single one of those scenarios or to manage that at one point was nigh impossible. But with things like vbind on your styles now, like, oh, so many possibilities now exist with this. And so if you're wondering though, why did I have a little bit of trouble with the HTML and the app, is because I think Vue, once it takes over the div, is unable to go outside of it. So that's what it is. It's just not in control, like Vue is not in control of that area. So if you're gonna do this, obviously make sure that you're within the context of your app, otherwise the CSS won't apply. Power of CSS and cascades and everything in its native form. And so all JavaScript's doing is it's actually just tracking this variable and just making sure to update that value. But the rest of it is CSS. So you get the power of CSS and cascades and everything in its native form, but you also get the power of getting reactive data that can impact those things. So you can imagine like, oh, the number of times I've been on apps where I wanted to customize the font size or the padding, like those are hard to do because to create a class for every single one of those scenarios or to manage that at one point was nigh impossible. But with things like vbind on your styles now, like, oh, so many possibilities now exist with this. And so if you're wondering though, why did I have a little bit of trouble with the HTML and the app, is because I think Vue, once it takes over the div, is unable to go outside of it. So that's what it is. It's just not in control, like Vue is not in control of that area. So if you're gonna do this, obviously make sure that you're within the context of your app, otherwise the CSS won't apply. But otherwise at this point, you can imagine just infinite user preference configuration that's possible with this. Or like some of that that we
It's not using is okay. In vbind is so vbind, so Vue is keep tracking the Vue is tracking. So Vue is tracking the reactive reference you attach to a particular CSS property value and update it when that change. So in other words, it's quite interesting.
The one other thing I want to talk about styling, which most people don't know about when it comes to Vue 3, is infinite user preference configuration that's possible with it. But otherwise at this point, like in one of those scenarios or to
Okay. So, and when it comes to now the routing and the management system, that kind of thing,
it's time for us to talk about routing with.
Okay. So, so that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.